So this is chapter 7, part 2, Women in an Expanding Nation. And there's parts of that chapter that we left out, and we're covering again the main highlights because of the way things are, and the things that I think will make it a little bit less stressful for all of you. Anyway, this is again, as I said, part 2. So we'll continue from here. Slide 2 is just a basic stock picture, of a time that we're talking about. So this is one that's supposed to represent the late 1800s, particularly the 1890s. So that's all that really is. We have to talk a little bit about the Panic of 1893. Now, the Panic is going to be what we would call either a bad recession or maybe even a depression today, where you have the economic cycle that at the high point it's cyclical. So the way I would draw it would be in a circle. I think I drew it for you at one point when we were still in the classroom. But you have at the very top prosperity, and then if things drop, you have a downturn, and then it drops a little more, you have a recession. And if that goes long enough and deep enough, then you're going to have a depression, or they call these basically depressions or bad recessions panics back in the 1890s. So that's what this is. This is a downturn. Now, we know that the economic cycle eventually you're going to see after a depression or a recession, you're going to see things start to pick up again, and then eventually you're going to have prosperity again. That's the economic cycle. So the panic that happens here in 1893 is going to end that enormous era of that economic growth with the railroads and all of the new things that came about from the railroads, and all of the important people that were out there actually starting new businesses and building many different ways for the United States to continue growing economically for a very long time. And of course, we have all the other developments and parts of our culture that are going to be changing constantly. I mean, we're going to see in the late 1890s, we're going to see advertising really hitting a new stride. We're going to see people buying more things as we have the second wave of the rather industrial revolution. We have the second wave of it coming in, which relies on, instead of, for example, steam, we're going to have electricity, and we're going to have more complex, more complicated things being built, and more of them in some cases, like we had before this. You had the railroad, and now we're going to have, during this period of the 1890s up to the period of World War I, 1914, you have the automobiles come in. You're going to have everything that goes with the automobiles, including gasoline and oil, and the ability for people to go from one place to the other on vacation. So the world is transforming amazingly in the United States in the late 1800s. Now, what we see here, though, too, is where they're trying to reestablish some kind of power in labor. Like labor, the people, the workers like you and me, we still didn't have a lot of protection. We were treated pretty badly. So we're going to see a lot of strikes. We're going to see a lot of strikes by these fledgling labor unions. And the labor unions, a lot of them are going to go away by the end of the 1800s. And one reason that a lot of labor unions are unsuccessful is going to be because of this panic, because this was a really big one. So what we notice here is, again, there's going to be a lot of violent strikes. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those. And there's a new political balance that's created as we're transforming ourselves from really a provincial economy, a provincial world, where in the United States we had regional flavor, regional politics, regional whatever you think of, that's starting to change, and it's going to become nationalized, really, in the sense of we're going to build a national identity. By the 1920s, it's pretty clear and pretty easy to see our national identity is getting kind of kind of almost full form. It's really changed a lot from who we were back in the colonial days, and then through the revolutionary days and the war, civil war, and all that. It's going to start to look a lot more modern like today. So railroads were overbuilt at the time. There were so many people that wanted to start railroads and invest in railroads. And this is what we call a speculative bubble. Okay, it allows people to invest. However, speculative bubbles are going to burst, like any bubble. It's going to burst at some point. So people are investing more money, but the railroads aren't making that much money. So the expenses are going to be greater than what they're bringing in as profit. So when all that happens, you're going to have a lot of banks that were tied to railroad financing that are going to fail. And then because they wanted some kind of sure currency, something that couldn't be devalued, you had a lot of people getting gold. There was a run on the gold supply, which is kind of like today with the panic buying, when there was actually a run on toilet paper before people really were told to lock down. People were kind of seeing what was coming. And it's the same kind of an idea, go and get some gold so you'll have something to use to trade because the banks aren't going to work for you anymore. But again, that's not going to be really until the Great Depression that we're able to fix the banks or the banking system a lot. In 1913, we're going to set up the Federal Reserve. And anyway, there's going to be several changes. Now, we're going to have a lot of these other companies, though, that are growing, continuing by vertical and lateral takeovers, the competition. Now, this is something that John D. Rockefeller did. If you're Standard Oil Company, for example, you would try to undercut and then put out of business or buy out other oil companies, which is one thing he did, one way he did it. But you also have other takeovers where you're going to buy some of the peripherals, the things that are actually attached to, say, the railroad, things like glass and steel and whatever. So I have a lot of companies doing those sort of things. And so this panic is going to spread to the United States. It's not just going to be isolated in New York City. Although just like today with the virus, I mean, it's going to be extraordinarily bad in New York City, but it's going to go affect the rest of the world, which shows that we are indeed building a new national economy for good and for bad. Another thing that's going on that's hurting women and men equally is going to be the farmers' issues, where we have the rural Americans losing their children, and a lot of times to the mass. I have it written as immigration and migration because both things were going on at the same time. Remember, people coming from other countries, as well as a lot of young men especially, going into the cities to find their fortune or to be independent or whatever, just like some of the young women were going to eventually be able to do in larger numbers in different ways sometimes. But a lot of the people out in the countryside, the farmers, they were basically having their children move away because there wasn't as much for them to do on the farm. And some of that was good because it was a result of new machinery, new techniques, and so on. Some of it, though, I mean, it was going to have an effect on the rural farmers. It turns out that they're barely able to survive during this time. And the railroad, I mean, the railroad is really hurting the farmers at this point because they start to raise the prices. Because remember, I told you the railroads are ailing already, they're in trouble already because there's been the big speculative bubble and there's too many railroads. So that means that the railroads are losing money. So they raise their prices then, which in this case, specifically, the farmers are affected because the prices, got to do with transporting the crops. Because today, you walk into a grocery store, the joke is sometimes you ask a kid, where does your food come from? And they're like, the grocery store. And we're so far removed from our food these days. But the truth is, it's not the way it's always been. But with the railroad, they're having to take the crops they grow and then they're going to be transported to other places. And the farmers simply don't have enough money to pay those exorbitant prices. So they started to form these alliances. Basically, these are going to be co ops which is where they come together, like cooperation, or, even like community or working together. And they're going to try to stand up to these banks and these railroads that really are being quite unfair to the farmers at that time. Farmers alliances involve women because by 1890 we had like 250,000 women who had enrolled in those farmers alliances. And see, this is where you have the beginnings of what's called the populist movement, or actually a populist party itself. Populism is something that's going to appeal to the masses, right? Popular, populist, appeal to the masses, sometimes called in this case with political party, the People's Party or the Populist Party. So women are going to join for the same reasons the men did, because the women are going to be working around the farm. They're going to be a part of the life exactly the same as their husbands. They're going to all be working together, just in the agricultural world before the Industrial Revolution, just like they always had. So they're going to want the same kind of reforms to help them with their poverty as it kept getting worse and worse. There was a woman who was lecturing for the Kansas Farmers Alliance, and I found a quote from her, and it said, "All things that are of interest to men are of like interest to women," which makes sense. Basically, the things that interest humanity are what they're talking about. And poverty is one of those things that should be taken up by humanity in order to remedy it. So populism is going to give women a way to speak up and become more involved in the larger picture that was becoming extraordinarily political by that point. Slide number 6, we talk about populism specifically, and you're going to combine the Farmers Alliances, men and women, both, and the Southern Alliance to form what became that actually a political party, the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party. So it came about in the 1890s, but it's going to be just like a lot of labor unions, a lot of things that are working for the poor. It's going to be gone before the end of the decade and the end of the century. And part of the reason why, it goes back to that panic of 1893, because as I said, that was a big one. And people were scared. They were scared to join unions. They were scared to join some kind of new political party that was very active. And when you talk about, and you go down to the fourth power, or not PowerPoint, but if you go down to the fourth bullet point, you'll see populism was an activist form of agrarianism. Okay. So if you've gone through this terrible depression slash recession, whatever, it's affecting your livelihood as your farmers, you're going to start to become hesitant to be out there showing your showing your alliances, really, as far as that goes, whether it's something like a literal alliance like the Farmers Alliance or whatever, but showing that you're standing up against the banks, that you're standing up against the railroads, and you're standing up against the elites, the wealthy, for yourself. You're standing up for yourself to the people who are keeping you in poverty. So after that panic of 1893, that becomes a scary place for a lot of people to be. So go back up to the third bullet point, and you're going to see that a lot of white cotton farmers in the South, particularly North Carolina, Alabama, and Texas, and struggling wheat farmers in the Plains states, particularly Kansas and Nebraska, and to some degree, I think Iowa was involved in that. This is where we're going to see populism really thriving for a while. Now, as I mentioned labor unions a minute ago, and mentioned that they're all working for the same ideas, which is to help eradicate poverty and the wealth gap, and all those things, the things that you would think of that would be out to the people to try to fix. You're going to see 1896, we have William Jennings Bryan becomes the Democrat presidential nominee. Now, William Jennings Bryan is going to shoot to a different degree of fame in 1925, when he's going to be the guy in Dayton, Tennessee during the Scopes trial, who is going to be supporting what was called the Butler Act, which forbade teachers, from teaching evolution in the state of Tennessee. So William Jennings Bryan is going to be on the side of not teaching evolution in 1925. And the funny thing, it's not funny, it's an interesting tidbit, is that trial was really difficult for Brian, and he ends up dying about five, I think it was 5, maybe 6 days, it was less than a week after the Scopes trial in 1925. And he ran for president several times in his life. So anyway, he becomes the presidential nominee here in 1896. So 1896 election comes around, and the um, the big issues at that time have to do with, of course, as we said, things that were caused by this panic of 1893. There's a lot of things that are familiar to us in different points in American history. When you get to the Great Depression, you're going to see some of the same exact problems, and other points in time in American history, as well as, really European history in general. But you're going to have a lot of things in 1893 that continue for quite a while, because it's having an effect on the larger economy. So we're going to end up with, because of the labor unions, as I mentioned before, you're going to have a lot of strikes that turn violent and gets really, there's some bloodshed, and we are going to talk about a couple of those. You're going to have a lot of low earnings by the big companies like the railroads, as we mentioned. You're going to have high unemployment, because if they don't make as much money, then they're going to have to lay off or, downsize their work, their labor. And so that's going to be another consequence of the Panic of 1893. And you're going to end up with something else that we see going on right now to a certain degree with gas prices. There's a whole other thing going on there. But it's really funny, because we look at the gas prices, that at one point a few years ago, here in little tiny, nowhere Kentucky, where we are, the gas prices got up to $4 a gallon several years ago for a while. And now the latest I saw, the cheapest one that I have seen, is $1.04 a gallon right here in the year 2020. So that's due to some other things. There's some other things going on with the oil, but sometimes you see something called deflation. Okay, deflation, which means that the prices go down, and that's a very bad thing. That means the corporations or the small businesses, the manufacturers, somebody's in trouble, probably all of them, right? So let's say you have a company that makes clothing, a factory, okay? And the factory produces however many thousands or tens of thousands of a certain product. Maybe it's whatever, certain type of dress or a suit coat or something. And they make so many of these, and then the market and the economy take a really bad downturn. You end up with something, say, like this Panic of 1893, but you've already produced all these goods. Well, you can't just sit there and say, well, I've already produced them, so I'm going to try to sell them at exactly the same price I was going to originally so I can make a profit. Well, you can't do that, because what's also happening out there at the same time is high unemployment and all of the other things that we saw. And as people are getting laid off, they have less money to buy your product. So deflation is going to happen. It's going to be present. It's going to be visible to us as a lowering of prices, right? A lowering of prices. You're like, well, that's great. Everything's cheaper. Well, not particularly great, because the reason usually it gets cheap like that when we talk about deflation is because you lower the prices, and still a lot of people cannot afford to pay those lower, maybe even really slashed prices, because of all those other things, particularly the loss of jobs and everything that is kind of like dominoes. It's really horrific. And we definitely saw that during the Great Depression. And there were a lot of idiomatic things, a lot of sayings about what we call today again deflation during the time of the Great Depression. And they all had to do with the fact that even though you're selling something very cheaply, I can't afford to buy it because guess what? I don't have a job. I don't have the means to purchase whatever it is you're offering. So I guess to sum it up with deflation, so you know exactly what we're talking about, this is where you see that deflation comes about is a decrease in the prices, right? But when does it happen? It happens when the inflation rate or the value of currency is going to fall below zero. Again, that's something to keep an eye on in our world today and really anytime, because deflation is not going to be a good thing, even though on the face we're like, yay, low prices. Okay, so anyway, back to this particular slide. Populism is going to have a platform they call the Omaha platform. Now, what the Omaha platform was standing for, what they were standing for under that banner, was getting rid of the national banks. Okay, graduated income tax based on, of course, your, which basically said, I believe in their day, that it would raise taxes on people who earn a certain amount of money per um, per year. So graduated means, of course, it's based on your income, and so if you make less money, you're going to end up paying, lower rate in taxes. The Populist Party on their Omaha platform was for the direct election of senators. Now, this is in the 1890s, and it's not going to be until I believe it was the 17th Amendment, unless I've lost my mind. The 17th Amendment is the one that gives us a direct election of U.S. senators. And sometimes I think about that and I'm like, well, it seems kind of intuitive to us, but there was a time when you did not have the ability to vote for the senators in your state, because before that happened, you had, the founding fathers believed that if you elected the senators, then that would make the states a little bit too close to um, really to the government, like the federal government, and some people really didn't want that. I mean, there's a little element of states' rights in there, but as I said, I believe it was the 17th Amendment that is going to allow us to elect senators directly from, two from each state by popular vote in the United States. So that was something that they were asking for that doesn't come about for a little while. Civil service reform, well, President Grant back in, he was elected in 1868 and again in 1872. Ulysses S. Grant had some scandals with giving his friends and family some jobs and his supporters. And so people wanted civil service reform. That was still a debate 30 years later, and it took a long time before they were able to make sure that you had to qualify to get a job in the government, in the civil service. And that was part of what the populists were arguing for. So 8-hour workday, 8-hour workday is a standard argument at that time throughout, even in Russia in 1905, they're going to have a big kind of a early precursor to the Russian Revolution in 1905 called Bloody Sunday in in sorry, I was I lost my water there for a second, and I've got a very sore throat, so that's not a good thing. But 1905, you're going to have in Russia this group of protesters that are calling for an 8-hour workday, and you see that becomes the standard thing. Also, the Populist Party wants government control of certain things. Okay, the railroad, the telegraph, and the telephones. Now, history is mixed in its reviews of the Populist Party, and the Populist Party sometimes I've heard them referred to as being very left wing and very progressive and so on. And sometimes I've read things. I've read the other side of the scholarly arguments that say, well, these guys weren't particularly progressive or left wing at all. They were just trying to react. So, in other words, reactionary instead of revolutionary. But they were trying to react to what was going on around them and kind of make a name for themselves at the moment. So, either way, the Populist Party is not going to stand much more because it's going to be gone pretty early in the 20th century. So, again, Populist Party. So, what about the women? Yeah, what about the women? Women are going to play a role in the Populist Party because a lot of women are going to still be trying to work very actively and tirelessly to get women's suffrage passed. So a lot of women see the populist movement with the alliances between the different groups and the farmers and everyone with women involved already. They see that as a way to get suffrage. So at the state level, the farmers' alliances are going to actually be for women having the right to vote. And when you had some governments that were elected, say, in a few places that were run by populist candidates, women do have the right to vote. Now that's why I always say when we got the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment, when it went into effect in 1920, when we got the right to vote, women had voted in other places in the United States before, but not on the national, federal level until the 19th Amendment. Okay, so we had the right to vote in Colorado in 1893, in Idaho 1896, and all that was a result of the populist movement. Now you have some of the populists now, I wonder where. Oh yeah, wait, mainly in the South. Sad. Objected to women entering politics. And so the National People's Party or the Populist Party, the specific party, never endorsed the platform of woman suffrage. You notice it was absent from what they call the Omaha platform, right? That's because they didn't want to turn off the Southern men who might vote for them. The active women with reform on their minds who joined populism and populist actions and were very much involved in the reform activities. Populist women are going to always believe in education. And one thing that they're actually striving for is some form of independence for women economically. Basically, it is going to be the bottom line, because if you don't have economic freedom, if you're dependent upon a man or anybody, if you're dependent on someone, then you can't have true independence and true freedom. So populist women believe in education and then economic independence, and that would lead to a quote better womanhood. Now what did that mean? Well, it depends on who you ask, but what they meant was basically that women should have more freedom, not only the freedom, the right, the privilege, whatever, it turns out to be, which actually, remember, the right to vote is a privilege, but they believe that it would make us better women if we were more independent and able to do what we wanted to do. So if you look at the second bullet point, this would lead to freer and therefore better choices in marriage instead of marrying a man because you have to get married and this is the guy that's asking you, so you better marry him because another one might not come along. You're going to make better choices if you know that you have economic freedom to take care of yourself if you need to or if you want to. And then a more culturally elevated farm life. So again, a lot of the women in populism, many of them came from the farm, from the rural areas, and they wanted to have a little bit more cultural elevation. They wanted to learn a little bit more about the culture and take that to heart. So by 1896, again, you're not going to have that as a platform. It's going to be removed again. So, or it's going to be removed completely by that time. and it was never a national platform. That's the big deal there. It was never a national platform for the Populist Party. So a lot of women got really discouraged with that act by the populist. The election, the election of 1896 is one of those elections that we talk about all these years later because there are quite a few significant events. But just to mention just a couple of things, William McKinley is going to win, and he's going to be popular in the East in particular, and particularly in the Northeast. So you have William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat. Remember, solid South. The South used to always be solid South, Democrat. So William Jennings Bryan's going to end up winning a lot of the South as well as the West and a lot of the Midwest. So we see that McKinley is going to win the majority of the popular vote. He's going to get over 50%. But in the Electoral College, it was insane because McKinley got over 270 votes and Bryan only got 170 something votes. So it was a big one. And there were a lot of mistakes that were made by William Jennings Bryan's campaign that had to do with the Electoral College and some of the states that they overlooked and a few of those. But we do see that McKinley and Bryan each had several million votes. McKinley got a little over, I think, 7 million, and William Jennings Bryan got over 6.5 million. So this was a pretty good turnout. It was something, I can't remember, I think it was a 79% turnout. This is the time period in American history where people voted. They got their butts out and they voted because they cared about who they're electing. And it's sad today when we have a non-presidential election, hardly anybody shows up, walk in there, walk right back out after you vote. And I always try to encourage everybody. I'm like, look, you need to vote, not just in the presidential election, because the other elections are very important. On your local level, you're going to have so many decisions made that you can find these elections on local levels sometimes being decided by 2 or 3 votes. So please try to vote. If you're not registered, register and vote for whoever you think is the best person to win, not just president. Okay. So anyway, McKinley's going to win, as I said, pretty handily as far as that goes. And the populists are never going to be able to get past this loss. Again, the populists had actually, I mean, William Jennings Bryan was the Democrat, remember. But remember, the reason we keep mentioning Populist Party is the populists had allied with the Democrats to run Bryan. Now, the women had gained the right to vote in a few states, but now, even though the populists by 1896 are no longer really talking about women's suffrage, now it's out there in the national stage and people across the country are talking about it. We need to address the Pullman strike because the Pullman strike that happens in 1894, this is while the great panic, the panic of 1893 is going on. And this is the first of the labor strikes that's going to really have national repercussions. You have a guy named George Pullman, there's a picture of him up there, and he owns the Pullman Palace Car Company. Now, the problem with George Pullman, well, there's a few, quite a few, but he believed that his workers should look on him as a father figure. He was paternalistic. Now, pa, pater, pa, anything that starts with that pot, that type of thing, pat, generally is masculine. It's a reference to a father, or like you say, grandpa, or you have grandma. Ma is maternal, and so on. So anyway, he's paternalistic, and he treats his workers as if they're his kids. And he built a town that was actually 600 acres, and he had his employees live there. Okay, not for free. They're paying rent, as you'll see. So during this panic of 1893, as I said, the railroads are in trouble. There's too many railroads, and the speculative bubble is growing bigger and bigger, and it's going to burst. So they don't need as many passenger cars. Pullman is going to cut the wages of his workers, who, by the way, live in his town, but he will not reduce their rent. So imagine that. He cuts the wages by 25%, but he keeps the rent at the same rate as it was before. So a lot of the homes that he had built in that, or had built, in that little town, or the 600-acre place where he required them to live, they weren't all that great. Some of them didn't have any kind of plumbing. Some of them were almost falling down. And look at this. Look at the second bullet point. The rent for these houses to live in, that because you're working for this dude, is already about 25% higher than if you were allowed to live somewhere else. Okay? Not in his housing. So it's 25% higher than if you lived somewhere else, you rented from anywhere else around town, and he's just cut your wages by 25%. So if you want a job, you have to live in his houses. It's a pretty good deal for Pullman, pretty terrible, terrible, sneaky deal for everybody else. So the workers are going to actually come up, kind of form this committee, and they send some representatives over to Pullman and said, we've lost this much of our wages. We can't pay this rent at this. And he said, nope. And he fired 3 of the guys that came to talk to him. So the workers decided that they were no longer going to work for those wages and try is the key word, try to pay those exorbitant rents. So in May of 1894, they walk off their jobs. May 10th is when they literally just said, we're not doing this. And on May 11th, the Pullman plant closed. What are you going to do about that, Mr. Paternal Pullman? Well, you've got the plant closed because 4,000 Pullman employees are now on strike. We have the appearance here of a guy named Eugene Debs, who is a socialist who does run for president several times. He'll come up later again, I believe, a little bit later. Maybe not so much in women's history, but in American history, he's a pretty big player. But we have the American Railway Union. Now, it's a union. Therefore, it's made up of workers who are trying to negotiate to get better wages and better conditions and all that. So the American Railway Union, this is where the Pullman employees, so the organization they belong to, and this is unskilled workers. So they actually, the unskilled railroad workers are told by the leader, Eugene Debs, to refuse to handle any of these Pullman cars, any Pullman equipment, because you want to be in solidarity with the Pullman strike. Okay, so on the other side, now remember, a union is always going to be the workers, right? So on the other side is the managers. The managers are the ones that don't want you to strike. The managers are the ones that are trying to make sure that the work is getting done, even if you're not getting paid fair wages, even if you're having to do this and this and this and rent from Pullman, whatever. So the General Managers Association is on the other side of the owners and the managers. And that's going to include a bunch of Chicago railroads. So as soon as the members of the American Railway Union refused to work with the Pullman cars or Pullman equipment, then the General Managers Association fired the switchmen. Who did that? So the American Railway Union, supporting the workers, said, okay, all righty then. All the rest of the railroad workers need to walk off the job in support of the Pullman strike. Walking off a job is easier said than done for most of us, no matter what's going on, even if it's a condition like the Pullman workers were going through, where you've had your wages cut and your rent's the same, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be hard, but you're going to have just a few days later, thousands of railroad workers all the way over 27 states are on strike. Now it's the unskilled workers. It's the people who have not had a lot of training, education, and so on. It's not going to be supported by the skilled workers, the engineers and the conductors and so on, because the engineers and the people who have had education and training to work for the railroad, they're going to be able to command a higher pay rate anyway because it's harder to replace them. So they don't support the unskilled workers in their strike. And that happens a few times throughout history. So transportation from Chicago all the way out west is going to be stopped. Governor of Illinois, this is one of the things, the states and the government are pretty quick to usually send in troops to help the businesses. In this case, the governor of Illinois is going to be on the side of labor. So he refused to send, I can't remember his name, but he refused to send in the troops. So the railroad operators said, all right, look, we're going to go above the head of this governor of Illinois. We're going to go straight to the president. And you know what? They did, because money's on the line. Remember, railroads are in trouble anyway. So how is it that the railroad operators and the managers and the people that are in charge of the railroads, how do they justify going all the way up to the president and the attorney general to get troops? I mean, the state is not sending in the National Guard. Why are we going all the way to the federal government? We shouldn't do that. Well, here's what they said. They said, you know what? They're committing a federal crime. Well, what's the federal crime? Well, the federal crime is there are mail cars carrying the United States Postal Service, carrying the mail, and they're being held back by this strike. That is why President Grover Cleveland, I don't know, what a name, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland and Attorney General Richard Olney are going to actually agree and send 2,000 troops up there to Chicago in July of 1894 to stop that strike. Okay, so when the troops come in, you know, it's the feds, it's the army, it's dangerous at this point. So you had a peaceful strike, and then it's going to get violent. Remember, this is the time where we have a lot of violent strikes in this era. So the workers are going to start to get really crazy. They're tipping rail cars, they're building blockades, and they're reacting to, again, the fact that the governor of Illinois had said he was on their side, but then they were actually steamrolled over by the president and the attorney general. Now, there's also the American Railway Union's leaders, Eugene Debs, remember, being the most important one, Eugene Debs. The ARU leaders were unable to communicate with the strikers because they were silenced. Okay, there had been federal indictments served to the leaders of the union saying you cannot continue this strike. So if they tried to communicate with the strikers, then they would be, imprisoned. It's a mess. So the riots are going to get bigger, and the World's Columbian Exposition in Jackson Park is going to end up getting just destroyed almost. 7 buildings are going to be destroyed by a large fire as a result of all this. And by July 6th, here again, hot summer time in Chicago, we're going to have 6,000 and more rioters that destroy 700 rail cars, causing at least $340,000 of damages in the South Chicago Panhandle yards. So $340,000 back then is millions of dollars worth of damage today. Now, why do we talk about the Pullman strike? What's the importance? So here we have on slide number 16, again, what I just said, the injunction forbidding the union to strike, and Debs and his associates are in prison. He's going to be imprisoned a few times. Eugene Debs is going to run for president from prison one year later on, the early 20th century, and he's actually going to get quite a few votes. He's going to run on the Socialist Party ticket, but he's going to get quite a few votes from his prison cell. So anyway, we have some real fun stuff in American history. So as the troops have come in, they're protecting what the unions call scabs, like a scab. This is someone who's going to cross the picket line and take your job if you're striking. So the troops, the military is there to protect the scabs, the people who are taking the jobs of the workers who were trying to get better conditions. So the union leaders like Debs and so on, like I said, they're going to be imprisoned in federal jail and the strike collapses. So once again, I say, why are we still talking about the Pullman strike all these many years later? Pullman strike is vital to understanding the world that women and men live in at this time, because it shows that if you're working for, say, a factory, if you're working for any kind of unskilled labor, that your unions really aren't that powerful just yet. And the big problem here is if the national unions could actually, well, if they could actually unite the way they should and protect the unskilled labor, that would be one thing. But they didn't have a lot of bargaining power. And part of that is because the federal government comes in and supports the capitalist, in other words, the owners, corporations and so on, against the labor, no matter how unified the workers are. So the long-term effects on women and men, because you do have a lot of women in these situations as workers and some of the unions, but you're going to have a lot of new workers unions that come out. Now, I will tell you that by the end of the 1800s, a lot of the unions are going to go away because of, as I said earlier, the Panic of 1893, which does not just happen in 1893. Remember, it continues for a while. So the Socialist Party of America is created in 1897 with Eugene Debs as the leader. And again, he runs for president later a couple of times. I don't remember how many, I want to say 8 times, but that sounds ridiculous. But it's possible. And then we're going to see the Sherman Antitrust Act. We're going to see some changes that are made to that. And the only way that they can strike is if you have certain guidelines you follow. So you're not allowed to ban strikes anymore as of this, um, the changes, the additions and subtractions and some rewordings of stuff in the Antitrust Act. But you're allowed to actually strike, but you just have to do it within certain parameters. And then we have the Erdman Act, which was passed in 1898. That's going to outlaw these yellow dog contracts that were set up by companies. And this is, I mean, this is going to come out also. You're going to have some form of this right immediately after the Pullman strike. But anyway, you're going to have a lot of places saying that if I hire you, you have to swear or you have to agree to not join a union. So anyway, that's the Erdman Act is going to outlaw that. And part of the Sherman Antitrust Act and part of the Erdman Act and so on is the idea that people should be able to make their own decisions whether or not they want to join a union. They shouldn't be forbidden from joining a union, especially if it's going to protect their rights as workers. So the Pullman strike is going to actually boost women's influence in social reform because of a whole bunch of different things that are going on at the same time. Pullman strike is going to show again the weakness of some of the labor union movement, and it's going to show that women getting involved is probably going to be one of the only ways that we can get some of these reforms passed. We're going to have more solidarity between women and men in order to move forward. Now, again, we don't have the right to vote, but we're going to see that the settlement house movement is going to come around during this time, around the time of the Pullman strike. So around the time of everything that's changing right at that moment. So Chicago had only about 350 people in 1833, and then by the middle of the 1800s, it had 30,000, and then by today, was it the third? I think it's the third largest city in the United States right now in 2020. And I think every now and then it's boosted up to the second largest. It goes like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. I believe for a while it was New York, Chicago, LA, and so on. But Chicago has become enormous. If you've never been there, I can highly recommend a lot of places you could go. I have family who live in Chicago, and it's a great place. But by 1870, it's going to have, increased more and more and more. And then by the time of the Pullman strike in 1894, there's over 500,000 people in Chicago. So the urbanization of Chicago is going to affect women in a big way. And we're going to talk about social work, the birth of social work, and the settlement house movement. So if we go back to the early Industrial Revolution days, back in the 1700s in England, you're going to see the same idea of ways or explanations, ways to describe some of the problems. Because the problems, as you end up with people just coming in and overwhelming a city, this rapid influx of people all living together is going to cause so many problems. Now, again, I've listed a few: crime, filth, overcrowding, disease. Okay, so Chicago was called back in the day. It was called at one point a city of garbage and gangsters. That actually sounds like it would have come from the 20s, right, with Prohibition. But anyway, Chicago still gets a bad reputation sometimes. But as I said, I like cities. I grew up in a city. I like cities. But Chicago, again, you look at this picture, and I love pictures so much. You can tell so much about the culture, and I always like to look at the clothes and look at the way that people seem to be moving around in whatever area they're in or whatever. And I have no legit idea exactly when that picture was taken, but I do see an absence, and tell me if I'm wrong. I see a guy on the right with a big belly sticking out there. I thought he was a car the first time I looked at that picture. But it looks like there's a rail car over there on the left, but it doesn't look as if there's cars. And I'm looking, the men are wearing hats, but this appears, it looks to me like it would have been the 1920s or 30s maybe when this picture was taken. Now again, that's just me. I'm just guessing. I have no idea. But I'm looking at hats. I'm looking at some of the styles. So I'll say that's probably a slightly educated, not very accurate guess. I have no idea. But I like that picture, so I put it on there. But anyway, Chicago's growth is going to cause them so many problems. And one of those things that happens is going to be the growth, well, the birth actually of settlement houses, and then the birth of a brand new profession, which is called social work, that's going to come out of that and come out of the concern for the immigrant population of Chicago. So if you're going into social work, or if you've ever been interested in where certain jobs or disciplines come from, here's a good example with the settlement house movement. Now, because Chicago had gotten so violent, and you had so many different things going on between the working class immigrants and the middle class, you're going to see that there's a need for intervention. And the women are going to play a very important role in what we call settlement houses. So the settlement houses are going to go back and originate with a movement in Great Britain, where you had a place called Toynbee House being the very first, located in London. So first you have to go back and see what was driving the idea of the settlement houses, okay? Now, these are not places where immigrants live. These are places that are located in the middle of poor areas in order to help the immigrants, okay, and the poor, okay? So it's going to be, these houses are going to be in the middle of some really rough neighborhoods in order to help those people rise above the poverty. So if you're going into social work, Or, if you've ever been interested in where certain, certain jobs or disciplines come from, here's a good example with the settlement house movement. Now, because Chicago had gotten so violent and you had so many different things going on between the working class immigrants and the middle class, you're going to see that there's a need for intervention. And the women are going to play a very important role in what we call settlement houses. So the settlement houses are going to go back and originate with a movement in Great Britain where you had a place called Toynbee House being the very first, located in London. So first you have to go back and see what was driving the idea of the settlement houses, okay? Now, these are not places where immigrants live. These are places that are located in the middle of poor areas in order to help the immigrants, okay, and the poor, okay? So it's going to be, these houses are going to be in the middle of some really rough neighborhoods in order to help those people rise above the poverty that they're living in, okay? Settlement houses. So you're going to have these, you're going to have, I think it's 400, more than 400 eventually settlement houses across the nation during this era. So the idea is at the very core that the environment is going to help an individual development more than their genetics. Okay, that's the age-old argument: heredity or environment, right? Nature versus nurture, etc. It's still, the jury's still out on some of that because some things are very clearly measured by science, and some genetic things and so on, maybe predisposition to certain conditions or whatever. But what they thought before, okay, a lot of people thought during this era back here, early 18, early 20th century, late 19th century, they believed that things like if you're ignorant, you're poor, you're a criminal, etc. It's going to be because of your genes, or they didn't know exactly, but they thought, well, you got that from your dad or your whatever. You and your brother, you're both criminals, so it must have come from, look there, your dad was a criminal too. So they figured it was something that may have been inherited, and they're not going to agree with that when it comes to the settlement house movement. They're going to say this is not the fault of the person directly because it can be blamed on their environment. You can't just say, well, I mean, he inherited that tendency to, fill in the blank, whatever. He inherited that tendency. No, they start looking for something else. And that's where, again, we come up with the nature versus nurture. And they believe that nurture is going to be more important. So they can try to help the people by improving their environment. So they, as far as when we're talking about they, the women and some men who are going to come in and work in the settlement houses are from the middle class. And they're trying to model and impress upon the poor in those really bad areas of Chicago and then other cities that the middle class value system is what will make you successful in the world. So they would try to model that for them in their dress, in their language, in their manners, in their, speaking, and in their customs. And that's, again, this is going to be a place where not the immigrants live, but the workers who are there from the middle class to help the immigrants and the other poor people. Okay. So that's an important distinction. So again, overcrowding and crime and disease, all sorts of pestilences, cholera, everything else going on in the cities. You're going to see that in these crowded immigrant areas, I mean, no running water, the hygiene is just completely lacking. And you're going to see into this world a guy named Jacob Riis. He comes up with a great book. I have a copy of it in my office called How the Other Half Lives. And Jacob Riis is a guy who's trying to expose these bad conditions that the poor are having to survive in, and he wants people to know exactly what's going on. So while he was living in New York, Jacob Riis is going to become a guy who he was impoverished and then he became a police reporter. And he spent a lot of time in the lower class neighborhoods and again used to be called the slums. Sometimes you still hear that word used, not as much as it used to be. But he spent a lot of time writing about the lives of the people, the things that they actually survived without, the little things they made do with, and all that. Okay, and his work is going to get a lot of notice from Americans. So his idea is if people know that this is going on, they'll figure out a way to help the poor living in these conditions. Now, he's also known for using flash photography. He's going to be really one of the what's the word? One of the trailblazers in photography by using the flash. So Riis, again, keep in mind his name and keep in mind How the Other Half Lives, because that's a book, if you ever get a chance, there's some incredible pictures in there. And I'm getting ready to show you a few of them on the next slide. You can see one on the right-hand side of this slide. But Jacob Riis is going to catch a little bit of flack for some of his pictures that he takes during this time. So let's go on to the next slide, and I'll talk about. As I said, Jacob Riis is trying to make the conditions of the poor known in the cities, in the slum areas, and he takes tons of pictures and he illustrates the conditions. Now, where does he get the flack from? Well, he gets some flack because it turns out that some of the pictures are proven to be posed. Now, I don't know about you, but if I look at the one on the top left of the little kids sleeping there outside, you can sort of tell, but especially the one on the far left, you can kind of tell that it looks like the kid is sitting there with their eyes intentionally closed, like squeezed shut or something. But anyway, a lot of these pictures they're going to find out were posed. Now, the problem is you can't just say, well, he posed all these pictures, so therefore these issues never happen. No, 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 no. That's not true. Okay, some of the pictures he posed, or he had the people pose because there were certain things he didn't feel comfortable necessarily going and just taking pictures of people while they're going about their business, and he would ask permission, and sometimes you would end up with great pictures and he would then ask for the permission to use them. But sometimes he would say, well, I'm not gonna do this without whatever. So he ended up having some of the pictures sort of reenacted from things that were real in those conditions that the people were living in. So Riis, having the early flash photography, and Riis being an immigrant himself, he had come from Denmark, and you have to look at him in the context of his time. But when he took pictures, he was working again with the very early flash photography. And some people have criticized his books in later times, saying that he had some racial biases. But again, we look at everything in the context of the time period. And Riis was he was a laborer when he came to the United States as a young man. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, in the panic of one of the panics, it wasn't 1893. It was one there was a panic about every 20 years for a while. So it was a panic of the 1870s, I believe it was, where he got extraordinarily, poor. He didn't have anywhere to go, anything to do. So this is how he had begun to feel that there needed to be someone who knew what was going on, someone who could help the poor immigrants in particular. So if you look at Jacob Riis, he becomes a reformer. He becomes someone who's really trying to spread this idea of helping the poor. And he's going to become, I mean, my favorite president is Theodore Roosevelt. I don't agree with everything that he ever did, but I like Theodore Roosevelt. He's going to be a friend of Jacob Riis. So one thing that's also kind of cool about Jacob Riis is he's going to be writing in in a way that makes you really understand the people. You're going to understand because he tells you stories about the people. He tells you just stories about this guy in this picture over here, or he tells you about a young girl and what happened to her, and what happened to her after she got married and how she ended up in this place and all this kind of thing. So again, I would recommend if you have a chance to read Jacob Riis. But anyway, those are just a few of his images, which I find particularly enchanting in the way that I love photography. So everything going on, the conditions of the slum areas, the poverty-stricken areas of the city, and everything else. This is going to be the right time where the settlement house movement's going to end up coming into the United States. Now, Jane Addams had gone on a trip. She'd gone to London, and she had encountered Toynbee House. So Jane Addams is going to be a woman who is at the heart of the settlement house movement in Chicago and the connection to social work as well. So the settlement house idea is going to be something that young women like, and it's something that keeps women, remember, in that position where they're still nurturing, they're taking care of someone. Because remember, if you're going to leave your home before you get married, you're expected to live at home, especially in the middle and upper classes. You're expected that it's expected that you're going to live at home until you get married. Maybe your dad's going to find you a husband. Maybe that's how it's going to go. But you're expected to stay at home. Well, um, the settlement house movement is going to help some of the young women who maybe didn't want to get married yet, or they wanted to have some independence, but they're from the middle class, not the working class. They're not going to go out, get a job in a factory and have a bunch of roommates. Now they have a slightly different way that they can scoot out of daddy's house and do something that is considered gender appropriate. So you're going to have the middle class women and even some from the well, I guess the upper middle class, the more wealthy, because you're going to have people like Eleanor Roosevelt who works in a settlement house for a while. But they're going to come in and try to help the poor and the immigrants and use something called social Christianity, which means they're trying to act as Jesus would do in helping the poor. So again, what I just said, young unmarried women can live away from their family in traditional roles of helping, teaching, caretaking, and they're living together. So there's a sense that they're taking care of each other, and even a sense that they're protected from all of the evils of the city because they're in a kind of a controlled environment there while they're helping the poor. There we have Miss Jane Addams herself, and she's going to give us the most famous of the settlement houses, Hull House in Chicago, opened in 1889. And again, this is going to be the model for I don't remember how many. It's more than 400, like I said. And you look at there on the bottom right, you see a picture, and then it's going to grow. It's going to be exponentially bigger. There's going to be more and more buildings added to this place as time goes on. And I love the picture on the bottom left. I would love to walk into that room right there. I would love to walk into that moment in the bottom left and see what's going on. I mean, I'm sure I would stand out a lot with my clothes, um, especially since I'm stuck working from home instead of being with all you guys at the moment, and I'm actually in my sweatpants and a sweatshirt and kind of a little bit sick from a sinus infection. So I'm sorry if my voice sounds kind of crappy, but I would love to walk in there, and I think I would probably argue with putting on a dress so I would fit in, but I would love to walk in there and just experience that moment right there in time. I think it looks so fascinating. But anyway, that's just me, and that's the way my brain works. Jane Addams, Hull House. And again, you can see my love for photographs. There you have some pictures from Hull House. And on the right, you have Jane Addams again as she's older, reading to some children, and the hanging lights and everything that I love about photography is present in every one of those pictures. So Jane Addams and Hull House they're gonna be intricately tied to social work because through I believe it's the University of Chicago, they're going to set up a program where they can actually credential people, and it was women usually at first, to become social workers. And from the very beginning, social work was a very dangerous profession because you always had people complaining that the social worker is going to come and tell them how to live their lives. Now, I have to tell you, I was a social worker for 3 years. I have a degree, a bachelor's in human services and counseling and social work. So I did that for 3 years, and it was more than I could stand. It was so hard. It was so hard for me emotionally to see the conditions of some of the people and the babies and the just it was very emotionally hard for me. So I had to leave that, leave social work, and I ended up, I'm so much more settled and happy these past 23, I think 23, 24 years as a college level teacher. But social workers have always had a very dangerous job, and people don't want you to come and tell them what to do or how to do it. But the settlement house movement and then the ensuing social work program or discipline or profession, whatever you prefer, is going to help just so many people learn how to navigate the waters from poverty up to the middle class. And sometimes that takes a lot of work, and sometimes as a social worker, you find that you're working harder sometimes to get them out of poverty um, than they are. So, anyway. So now we come to another really important woman. We have Florence Kelly, okay, the impatient crusader. She was an early suffragist. Remember, I always kind of in my mind, I have parentheses there saying suffragette, because suffragette, that was where they're feminizing it and they're making it sound like an insult, suffragette. So a lot of the women, you're going to prefer to use the word suffragist. But she was born into a family, 1859, before slavery had ended. She's born into a family that was very much against slavery. And her father had even helped work on the 14th Amendment. Remember your Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment frees the slaves. Say it with me. 13th Amendment frees the slaves. 14th Amendment makes them citizens, and the 15th Amendment gives the black men the right to vote. Okay, Reconstruction Amendments. That's important stuff to remember. So her father had helped work on the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Amendment, basically, and there's a lot more to it, as you know, but that's how we think of it in the context of abolition and so on. Now, she is a socialist who actually translated Frederick Engels' book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England. Now, Frederick Engels, or Friedrich Engels, he's a guy who was closely associated with Karl Marx. He wrote he wrote quite a bit of a body of work with Karl Marx on basically Marxism, Marxist socialism, as it became known eventually, or sometimes they call it scientific socialism, because they believed that there was a pattern to to history. When you looked at it, you could make predictions about what was going to happen in history by looking to the past. And Frederick Engels and Karl Marx believed that there would be a violent overthrow of the capitalists, of the owners, the managers, the people who are making the money, by the workers, because the workers' conditions were so bad that he believed, well, Marx and Engels believed that eventually the workers would have had enough and they would take over. And then ultimately the goal was to have a society with no social classes. Everyone's going to be equal. And that would be, according to Karl Marx, a more evolved form of socialism that Karl Marx said would be communism. So that gives you an idea of what she's translating. She's translating from a socialist Marxist point of view here, this book, and she's going to be a full-blown socialist. Okay, now again, today, all the people who I can say were supporting Bernie Sanders, maybe still are, but I believe just very, very, very recently, Bernie Sanders dropped out of the election for the year 2020 for president. And I've asked a lot of people, I'm like, okay, you support Bernie Sanders, who is running as a Democrat, but he also is a socialist. And, they're like, well, there's a distinction. He's a democratic socialist. And I'm like, okay, well, what's a socialist, first of all? And then tell me what's a Democrat. And I haven't found anyone who could really explain that. I had one guy, one student or former student or someone talking to me, and he's like, well, I don't know, I just know that I like him and I support him. And I'm like, y'all, you gotta, there's nothing wrong with socialism, democratic socialism, whatever, nothing wrong with any of that. I leave everybody to their own ideas, I don't care. But I want everybody to know why you believe something. Why do you support this person or that person or whatever? So anyway, I'm just putting that out there because it's important to know what you're standing for. And again, I love a lot of those ideas. I love the utopian socialist, to be, perfectly frank. I love the utopian socialist ideas, which are a little bit different, a little bit earlier than Karl Marx. But I don't know how that would work in a country as big and complex as ours. But anyway, that's an editorial. That's just my own opinion. That's just me kind of musing here aloud. But I also have a lot of tendencies to want a very small government and a lot less government control. So I'm kind of a paradox, as I think we all are. So what about Florence Kelly then? Well, she's going to leave an abusive husband. She's going to run away, far away to Chicago with her 3 children. And she's going to get involved with Hull House as a resident worker. That means that she's going to live there and be a model and try to help the poor, and also a scholar. One thing that socialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s, one thing that socialism is really fighting for is fighting for, of course, a lot of things like the 8-hour, things like the Omaha Platform. A lot of that was very much similar to this. Things like the 8-hour workday. And she's going to go out and fight for labor improvements, better working conditions and all that. So again, 1893, she's going to get the legislature of Illinois to pass a law for the 8-hour workday for women. Okay, it's different. It's going to take a long time for all this stuff to finally make a lot of sense later and be coherent, but we're on the way, right? 1894, she gets her law degree from Northwestern, which is a magnificent university. Also, if you're like me, I love to just go to to college campuses and wander around and look in the libraries. If you're allowed to go in the library, I love to do that. But I'm a nerd, self-admitted history nerd. But in 1894, she gets her law degree from Northwestern. She takes the test. She's admitted to the Illinois bar, so she is an attorney. She's going to study child labor in the sweatshops, these terrible places where they're working the children and they're paying them children and women also, paying them very little. And she puts out a report for the Illinois State Bureau of Labor. And she is going to really she's going to pull no punches. She's going to tell them everything she sees in there in this report. And in 1893, she's going to be appointed as the first factory inspector for the state of Illinois. And that's extraordinarily important, because now that they're taking it seriously, that there's a problem with labor in those factories, they're going to appoint somebody who has studied about it, who has seen it, and who understands it, and that is Florence Kelly. So the story of the really quite amazing Florence Kelly continues. By 1909, she's trying to get a minimum wage law, and that's not going to happen again for quite a while. And she's making progress, though. She's put it out there. It's a national conversation. She considers her greatest accomplishment the 1921 Shepard-Towner Act. Okay, the full name Shepard-Towner Maternity and Infancy Protection Act. Now, the problem with the Shepard-Towner Act is by 1929, it never becomes a law. First of all, it keeps getting renewed a couple of times, but it never becomes a law. And part of the reason it never becomes a law is because it is not going to be heavily supported by women as voters. In other words, women don't form a voting bloc for women's needs. Okay, just like men don't, there's not really a voting bloc where you say, well, all the men are going to vote for that. You know, there's not really a voting bloc where you say, well, all the women are going to vote for that, clearly. And just like you hear it with ethnicities or you hear it with certain groups, and you're like, well, certainly this group will vote for this party. Well, Shepard-Towner Act is going to fail partially because women are not really voting the same way. Their vote's going to be distributed out among all the different, all the different, the different party, the two different major parties and different candidates. And so the men don't feel like they have to really try to win the women's votes. So when it comes up again, eventually, it's going to be, well, it takes whatever it is. What is it? I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill from Schoolhouse Rock. You can see how a bill becomes a law. Well, the Shepard-Towner Act never became a law because you didn't have that majority in the Senate that passed it. And part of that was because the women weren't speaking loudly enough with their votes, okay, as any kind of a voting bloc. Now, 1925. She is, again, brilliant. I can't say enough about how brilliant Florence Kelley is. She's going to compile the Supreme Court minimum wage legislation. You can look that up. It's pretty amazing work if you have a chance to kind of read through that. It's easy to find. It would be easy to talk all day about all the things that Florence Kelley did. As you can see, I'm a big Florence Kelley fan. But some other things that are vital was she helped establish the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. She's going to be a pacifist. Now, she and Jeannette Rankin, if you remember Jeannette Rankin, the first woman, I guess, that served in Congress, she's from Montana. Jeannette Rankin's on, I think, on your study sheet, maybe. But Jeannette Rankin is the only person that voted against both World War I and World War II, speaking of pacifist. But anyway, Florence Kelley is going to oppose United States involvement in World War I. She's going to be a member of the Women's Peace Party, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So all of that, down there at the bottom, that shows the pacifist nature. Now, the last couple slides here have to do with the Spanish-American War. So let's get to that. Spanish-American War is one of our most forgotten wars sometimes. And by the 1890s, we saw Cuba and Puerto Rico were really all that was left of Spain's, quote, New World, end quote, empire. And by the 1860s, if you go back, to the 1860s, the Cubans had already tired long before that of the Spaniards ruling them. So Americans started to hear terrible tales of things, starvation, disease, concentration camps, and a lot of this was very true, that the Spaniards were mistreating the native Cubans. So we try to stay out of things down there, but at some point we have a couple things that kind of cause America to get into a war with Spain over Cuba. So there was this letter, the Duque de Loma letter, that was stolen and published. And this particular letter actually calls the President of the United States, William McKinley, very soft and weak or something like that. That enrages the American people because even though a lot of Americans thought he was kind of weak and probably wouldn't do anything, you don't want to hear someone from Spain saying that about your president. Okay, you can talk amongst yourselves about your crazy Aunt Sally, but you don't want another person outside your family to talk about Aunt Sally that way. Same idea, right? Now, we have the explosion of the Maine. This is the USS Battleship the Maine that had been sent down there to kind of keep the peace. Now, what happened was, we know later that it was actually an organic fire. I mean, it started in the boiler room, but and it was an explosion. But people immediately blamed it on the Spanish. So we see up in the United States, we're going to have a lot of people in the newspaper industry that are trying to start a fight. And we start a war right there with Spain. We go down, send more troops. And Theodore Roosevelt, who is Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, is going to quit his job and go, and he wants to be right on the front lines of this war, and so on. Okay. So the Spanish American War is about expansionism, it's about imperialism, but it started out as we were going into Cuba to try to free the Cubans from the Spaniards because we heard of the treatment the Cubans were having. So again, we go there, send troops to try to free Cuba, but we end up expanding our influence and we take some of the Spanish territories. Ultimately, we end up with Puerto Rico, Guam, and then we're going to fight a war, really, really, probably the most forgotten bloody war that we fought, probably, was the war with the Philippines. And then in 1898, we're going to actually annex Hawaii as a colony. So we're going to gain a lot of territory. And this is considered by people of the time, and we look back today through our lenses, and pacifism wasn't considered to be all that masculine. If you're a man, you need to go fight. So the imperialism, the expansionist tendencies, the idea that we're going to go down there and fight and take that land seemed to be, or seems to be, we can say, the epitome of masculinity if we're going to try to analyze it in that light. So what about the women in the Spanish-American War? As far as the women go, we're going to see that the women are going to be raising funds to support the war effort. And a lot of them are going to be so angry that the United States are going to be, or that the United States is going to be attempting to gain more territory for ourselves. Now, again, this is called a land grab. And you've got war hawks, the ones who want to go to war, like Theodore Roosevelt. And then we've got our pacifists again, Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, even Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist. They're going to be speaking as much as they can to as many people who will listen, saying that they believe the idea of imperialism, trying to build a nation by getting more and more land, taking Spain's old empire, is bad for the United States. Because what the anti-imperialists are going to say is the people have the right to govern themselves. If we go into the Philippines and we supposedly liberate them from the Spaniards, wait a minute, what's making us any better than the Spaniards? We're still occupying Filipino territory. So we're going to have people like Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Susan B. Anthony, who are anti-imperialist, anti-expansionist, pro-governance by the people, by the people's choice, right? And then you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that we've talked about before. She's going to be a supporter of U.S. expansion in certain places. Now, in this case, one of the things that I had read about her was where she was specifically talking about civilizing, and look at that in quotes, the Filipinos. Now, in that sense, what that meant was bringing them white American Protestant culture. Now, I don't know if you know this, I don't know if it matters, but it kind of does in the big picture, because religion just kind of shapes a lot of political things throughout world history and so many other things. Yeah. But the Spaniards are going to be very much Roman Catholic. Okay, the Spaniards, Spain actually starts out with Ferdinand and Isabella from Castile and Aragon. You're going to see those two monarchs come together in a Catholic alliance, and we eventually end up with much of that territory becoming Spain. So the Spaniards had the presence on the Philippine Islands for a long time, and to this day, you're going to see many, if not most, I believe, most, I think, of the Filipinos are going to be Catholic. Okay, so again, you're going to have some people who are wanting to bring in the white middle class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP, the WASP idea to the Filipinos. And the Filipinos did not want to be taken over by Americans. They also didn't want to be converted away from their religion. So that's the end of chapter 7. That's the main things I want you to know about chapter 7. Please email me if you have any questions. And I'll try to get the quizzes up as soon as I possibly can. Like I said, I'm getting a bit sick. I had a telephone. It wasn't a video. It was a telephone thing through Norton Healthcare today with a provider trying to figure out what's wrong with me, and I believe it's just a sinus infection, but dang, it makes my throat so sore. So again, I'm sorry if my voice sounds all wonky and if I'm a little bit spacey, but you guys know me. I miss all of you, and I will see you on chapter 8 when I get that particular one recorded and when it finally posts. Bye for now.